Hello, I'm Michael Lakey, and this video is for the module TMM2051, New Testament Studies, and this is week 7 of the module, and we're looking at St. Paul, specifically 1 Corinthians. And this is the third video for this week, and it's entitled Theological Issues. Now, we probably need to say at the outset that theological issues is a little bit of a misnomer, because what we've actually got in 1 Corinthians is Paul's response to correspondence and reports that we don't have access to. And Paul's response is a response to a whole series of practical matters, with some theological issues interspersed. And of course the practical matters, because we're dealing with a New Testament community, Jesus devotees, there are going to be all sorts of theological issues attached to that. But in the first place, 1 Corinthians doesn't present itself as a work of theology. And that needs saying, because actually what we're doing is we're extrapolating from the text, or if not extrapolating, inferring from the text. And there's nothing wrong with inferring from a biblical text, but we need to be clear that that's what we're doing. So let's have a think about some of these practical issues that Paul is addressing, and then let's have a think about some of the theological ideas that might be attached to that. So the practical issues. In chapters 1 through 4, we've got factions. In chapters 4 through 7, we've got sex and marriage. In chapters 8 through 10, we've got dining practices. In chapters 11 through 14, we have worship and gifts of speech and knowledge. And then in chapter 15, we've got resurrection. And it's fairly clear at some level that the question of factions is a question of division, which raises for Paul quite profound theological questions about, well, what is the church? The practical matters raised in chapters 4 through 10 are primarily about issues of conduct, but there's a whole series of theological ideas that Paul brings to bear, and we'll have a look at some of them. And then similarly with worship and gifts of speech and knowledge, we might want to talk a bit about how Paul understood Christian worship. So let's have a think about that over the course of this video. It's also clear that as one reads the epistle, that some of the difficulties that the Corinthians are finding themselves in are related to their experience of being a small group, not necessarily terribly high status, although not necessarily terribly low either, living in a particular kind of environment in Roman Corinth. And it isn't just Paul's response that we need to look at when we're trying to work out what theologically might be at stake, either for the Corinthians or for Paul. It's also the social world of Roman Corinth, and there's a real question of what was that like. But first, let's just have a quick look at factions and philosophy. So if we go to 1 Corinthians, one of the things that we find is that Paul opens the main body of the text with an appeal to be in agreement, and it may be that he's beginning there because that's the beginning of the verbal reports. Certainly he mentions verbal reports in verse 11, but it's also worth thinking that, maybe Paul begins somewhere that's really very important to him. we've got verbal reports all the way to chapter 7, the end of chapter 6. And some of those verbal reports relate to matters of conduct. Paul could have begun there, but he doesn't. He begins with questions of divisions, and it may very well be that Paul regards divisions as being, key to understanding what follows, or if not key to understanding what follows, then something that you would address first because it's a matter of first order importance. And the key phrase here is verse 12. Each of you says, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ. And there we've got the question, the rhetorical question, has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized into the name of Paul? There we've got 3 rhetorical questions to which the answer is definitely no. Christ has not been divided, Paul wasn't crucified for you, and you weren't baptized into the name of Paul. And that says at least 3 things. Firstly, that for Paul the unity of the church is intrinsically bound up with the unity of Christ. Just as there is one God and one Saviour, so there is one community. And so divisions for Paul are a matter of first order importance. It's also worth noting that Paul begins in chapter 1 with was Paul crucified for you? The implication being there that what Christ was crucified for them. Which is a theme to which he returns in chapter 15. And so there you've got what you would call soteriological themes. Christ crucified for. Of course, there's an entire rich stratum of theological work on the question of what exactly it means for Christ to be crucified for. But there is no doubt that for Paul, the crucifixion of Christ was for. Were you baptized in the name of Paul? And there we've got a little bit more kind of theological background, and this must be material that the Corinthians are familiar with and Paul shares, because the nature of the appeal and the nature of these rhetorical questions is such that Paul is clearly expecting the Corinthians to be answering no. And so, were you baptized into the name of Paul? Well, firstly, that shows that being baptized, and specifically baptized into the name of Jesus, was a standard formula for both Paul and the Corinthians, regardless of the fact that Paul goes on to say that he didn't baptize very many. That being baptized into the name of the Messiah is actually crucial for Paul. There's a difference there between the formula that Paul seems to suggest and the formula that's used at the end of Matthew's Gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. There's probably several PhD theses there in just explicating that difference, but it's worth pointing out that being baptized into the name of Jesus is for Paul something that constitutes the basic unity of the baptized community. And this is something that he returns to. You're probably familiar with his famous statement about baptism in Galatians 3. As many of you as are baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female. Then he goes on to point out that you're all one. And so the point here is that unity of the church is a first order matter for Paul, but it intersects with Christology, with soteriology, what you might say about Jesus, what you might say about the work of Jesus, and it also intersects with, ritual induction, our initiation into that community, our being brought in. And so that's a key matter for Paul. And it's interesting. We mentioned last week, when I mentioned a few times, that Paul there are these sandwich structures in 1 Corinthians where Paul will write a bit about a topic, then there'll be an excursus, then he'll write a bit more about a topic. And the excursus is usually something that develops the argument. And you see this in 1 Corinthians 8, 9 and 10, where 8 and 10 are about ritual meals and 9 is about giving up your rights. Here, chapter 1 and chapter 3 and 4 are about how to view Christian leaders and how not to be divided about them. And chapter 2 is all about the wisdom of the cross. And so the question there is, well, what's the relationship? What's the relationship between wisdom and these divisions? What's the relationship between wisdom and these divisions? It's worth pointing out that let me see, chapter 2, when I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And so Paul claims, whether because he's making a virtue out of a necessity or whether because it's a deliberate strategy, that he hasn't come to persuade, that actually he's come to proclaim, and his speech and proclamation weren't in plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and power. And Paul wants the Corinthians to be convinced because the gospel is true, not to be convinced because he's a good speaker. Now, that might give us a little bit of an inkling into what's going on. Maybe some of these divisions between the Corinthians are divisions between teachers based upon how eloquent or outstanding speaker the teacher might be. And Paul then goes on to say in verse 6 of chapter 2, yet among the mature we do speak wisdom, but not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age. So he goes on to point out that actually he does speak a wisdom, but it's the wisdom of the eschatological message, the message that God has decreed before the ages, that all things will be reconciled in Christ. And the point is that it may very well be that that some of Paul's critics, because we should imagine that some of those who claimed to be disciples of Cephas or Apollos were critics of Paul, and there might be a Christ party that claimed to stand above them all, or apart from the fray. But the point there is that at least some of this is attached to the attractiveness or otherwise of a particular leader's rhetoric and oral delivery, whether they appear wise. And I think this is worth considering as a major theological issue in Paul. We'll come to why in a few moments. So we then go on to chapter 3, and Paul begins to address the question of division over leaders. I fed you with milk and not solid food. Even now you're not ready, you're still fleshly. As long as there is jealousy and quarrelling among you, are you not of the flesh? It's worth thinking that if the Corinthians were people who were claiming to be spiritual, or at least if some of the Corinthians were claiming to be spiritual, that Paul's criticism that I can't treat you as if you're spiritual, you're still fleshly, is a gentle pushback against that. It's a rebuke. The fact that you're arguing means that you're not what you think that you are. The fact that you're divided means that you're not what you think that you are. And then Paul advances his own take on the relationship between himself and fellow servants. So what is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, and the Lord is the one that assigned to each. There's a whole series of images that Paul uses of the Corinthians being like a building, particularly a temple building, I think. Also being like a field. The point being that the Corinthians themselves, for Paul, are like a building that requires multiple workers in order to build it. But it's the Lord's building. But he then changes his image and then addresses the Corinthians directly. Don't boast about human leaders because everything belongs to you. How? Well, the leaders that you boast about, and part of your boasting is you say, I belong to this leader or I belong to that leader. All of the leaders actually belong to all of you. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the present or the future, everything belongs to you. And then everything is rolled up into belonging to Christ, and Christ belongs to God. And so Paul first addresses the Corinthians head on with just a dismantling of the way that they think about the relationship between wisdom and leaders. The second thing he does in chapter 4 is to redirect attention to God as the one who evaluates leaders. I don't even judge myself, verse 3. I'm not aware of anything against myself, verse 4, but I'm not acquitted because it is the Lord that judges me. Therefore, do not pronounce judgment before the time. And it's difficult to avoid the implication there that Paul regards boasting in this leader or that leader, comparing their rhetoric or their wisdom, their eloquence, their works of power, their spiritual giftedness. All of this boasting is not only fleshly, but it's also spiritually dangerous because it assumes a role of judgment. And Paul applies this when he talks about, in verse 8 of chapter 4, to the Corinthians with a bit of sarcasm. Already you have everything you want, already you have become rich. Quite apart from us, you have become kings. Implication being you're the one doing the judging here. And then Paul finally makes one last appeal. I am your father, and I don't mean this in a kind of Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker way, but rather he uses a standard appeal that any ancient teacher might do, and appeals to them as a father. Now, the sociologists would call this language fictive kinship. Fictive kinship simply means it uses family language to describe a relationship which isn't consanguineous, a blood relationship. But here Paul is describing himself as the one who begat them in the gospel, the one who brought them into being. But anyway, I think there's a few issues there. And it's interesting to see how the important theological issues of the unity of Christ, the unity of the church, the salvation work of Jesus Christ, and the significance of baptismal initiation into all of that. It's important to see how all of that ties together around a controversy which is ostensibly about teachers and whether Paul's rhetoric is any good. So there we've got a few issues. So let's go back and have a look at another topic. Dining practices and social status. Actually, one thing I do need to show you before we move on to dining practices and social status, I just want to show you something from 1 Corinthians 6. 1 Corinthians 6 verse 12. All things are lawful for me. All things are lawful for me. And this is repeated also in 1 Corinthians 10:23. Let's have a quick look. All things are lawful. The point of this is, you probably notice at various points in 1 Corinthians that there are speech marks put around some of the text. And those speech marks, as we know from last week and the week before, those speech marks aren't original. Those speech marks are added, and they're supposed to signal to us that this is Paul quoting somebody else. And it may be Paul is quoting the Corinthians, all things are lawful for me, that this was something that the Corinthians said quite a bit, or it may be Paul is quoting something that he has said to the Corinthians, or it may be that he's quoting something which, they both know. You'll see in verse 7, chapter 7, verse 1, that there's a similar set of quotations around the phrase, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. One thing that you should be clear about is that these quotation marks are added by translators as a way of signalling to the reader that they ought to read this particular material in a particular way. Sometimes I think they get them right. Sometimes I think that they get them wrong. So there's also in verse 13, food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food. And God will destroy both one and the other, is not in speech marks. I would put God will destroy both one and the other in speech marks. But the translators of this passage haven't. But it's interesting to read through some of these passages and just speculate as to, if the speech marks weren't there, would you assume that there was a kind of to and fro between Paul and how he imagines the Corinthians? Now, why is that important? Because some of these speech marked materials are a little bit like slogans that represent ideas that were quite popular in wisdom materials across the ancient Near East and across the Mediterranean. One of the most popular ideas in wisdom materials is the idea that if you're wise and you know the true nature of things, that all things are permissible to you because you know how to use things well. So you can be free because you're wise. This is something that crops up particularly on the lips of the Stoics. There's a Greek historian called Diogenes Laertius who states that the Stoics regard the wise to be not only free but also kings. Indeed, that only the wise are kings. Why? Because there's a kind of authority and ownership that comes from knowing how to use things properly. He also said that possessing all virtues, the wise are the only ones that understand how to use the things of the world correctly. The Greek writer Plutarch attributed to the Stoics that the phrase all things will be yours. Does that sound familiar, going back to 1 Corinthians 3? None of this is to suggest that Paul or the Corinthians would have identified themselves as being Stoics or Cynics. It's just simply to say that maybe these are ideas that are shared by the Corinthians, and that Paul, when he's referring to them, is referring to ideas that are common knowledge, but that some of these ideas relate to how the wider culture, including the philosophical tradition, thought about the relationship between wisdom and how we ought to live. And it's important to see that because actually one of the things that we find when we look at ancient moral discourses is that, like today, writers will take the same argument and make quite different things of it. And so, and in another section from Diogenes Laertius, comments that the early Greek Stoic writer Chrysippus believed that the incest taboo and the death taboo were matters of social convention, and that therefore that they weren't ultimately binding. And his argument for that was basically that they were contrary to nature, that nature didn't require them, hence they were conventional. And his argument might have easily been expressed using the phrase food for the stomach and the stomach for food, 1 Corinthians 6. I'm not saying that he did use those words. I'm just saying the idea that bodies are set up for the satisfaction of particular appetites appears to be an argument that some Corinthians are rather smitten with. But interestingly, other Stoic writers argued that it is within the nature of all human beings to form themselves into societies, and those societies have conventions, and that you ought to obey those conventions because it's natural for human beings to obey conventions. And because of that, there were other far more conservative Stoics who would have taken the same argument about living in accordance with nature, and they would have pressed it in the opposite direction and said, well, no, these taboos are good things and ought to be observed. And it's quite interesting that you see that there's a similar division of opinion between the Corinthians. There are some Corinthians that think you can visit prostitutes because food for the stomach and the stomach for food, you've got the appetite, you might as well satisfy it. And then there are other Corinthians that are asking the question, well, should we really have sex at all? And it may very well be that some of the texture of the moral disagreements that are going on in 1 Corinthians might actually indicate that what we're dealing with is a basic division in the way, ancient people who knew a little bit about the ideas of their culture thought about these sorts of topics. And particularly in relation to the question of wisdom. So just to say that's, there's a wide body of issues that, this question of factions and wisdom and eloquence and spirit might relate to. Then let's have a think about dining practices. Well, in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul talks about strong and weak. Let me show you. So let's go on to 1 Corinthians 8. So apparently some are eating, some believe that because of the knowledge that they possess, they know that there are no idols in the world, in the sense that there's only one God, and therefore all the other gods are false gods, and therefore everything there's true religion and there's Gentile superstition, and because of that, the rituals of the Gentiles can't really hurt anybody. Therefore, they've been comprehensively demystified. Therefore, nothing is impure of itself. Therefore, we can eat the food that they sacrifice to this one or that one or the other one, because it does no harm, and the food itself isn't changed because these idols don't exist. And Paul addresses this by first agreeing with that argument, at least in part. Verse 7, it's not everyone who has this knowledge. Some are so accustomed to idols until now that they think of the food they eat as offered to an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. The point being, according to Paul, is that, not everybody is able to, occupy that high intellectual vantage point. Some people are accustomed to viewing things a particular way, and there's no way they could eat without feeling that they were doing something wrong. And Paul describes their conscience as weak. And the language of strong and weak is something that gets applied quite a bit in some of the Pauline epistles. It crops up again. It crops up at various points in the Corinthian correspondence. It also crops up in Romans in relation to similar issues. The point being is that there are some who believe that they're strong, have strong consciences, and can go ahead and exercise their freedom fully. And then there are others that Paul and the strong regard as having weak consciences, consciences that are liable to convict them that they've sinned. And Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 8 is that the strong ought to take seriously their strength and give it up for the benefit of the weak, and that it would be better not to eat than for a weak brother or sister to have their conscience tainted or defiled by doing something that they believe to be wrong. And so there we've got the language of strength, the language of weakness, questions of freedom, and questions of knowledge. In other words, we've got a similar set of issues to some of the issues we've just described. Wisdom and knowledge seem to be running themes in this part of 1 Corinthians. So let's have a quick look back at dining practices. It's worth asking ourselves, what would your social status be if you prided yourself on having an illuminated relationship with the material world through your knowledge, that you described yourself as strong, that you had a fascination with wisdom and eloquence, and so on and so on. How do these issues line up with broader questions of social status in the Corinthian community and in Corinthian society generally? It's worth bearing this in mind when we ask questions like this, because of course the eating of meat was not an everyday occurrence in antiquity, and so this question of should we eat idol meat presumes a certain amount of money in order to buy the idol meat, or a certain amount of social connectedness to be invited to dinners where it might be served. In other words, we're talking about social status here. We're talking about, to what extent those characterising themselves as wise and strong are also the moderately wealthy or the socially connected. And this raises questions of how wealthy were the Corinthian Christians. What access did they have to meat, to social events like dinners? How did being a Christ believer bear upon involvement or otherwise with these traditions. It's worth thinking about a few issues in relation to that. Firstly, what was the relationship between Greco-Roman religion and the material economy in most Roman cities? Where did meat come from? Well, most of the time it did come from sacrifices, because people didn't eat a great deal of meat, because vegetables are inexpensive and cows are not. But also, how did ancient notions of social status interact with this? The work of the illustrious Wayne Meeks is utterly superb, and I commend to you, it in its entirety. But it's worth, at the very least, thinking that ancient Roman cities would have been, the technical sociological term would be agonistic, that framed by a social hierarchy with a value that within that hierarchy that relates to honour or prestige or esteem. And so, there may have been, if you were a low status member of the Corinthian church, you can well imagine that if you had a pagan patron, you might have certain obligations to go and dine with him or her at your patron's expense. And so, it may very well be that these issues of dining are broader than the question of whether the Corinthians themselves could afford meat. And it may very well be that they relate to every layer of Corinthian identity. Of the Corinthian community. But there's also this question of the relationship between the knowledge and strong terminology and the question of social status. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul uses a phrase, those having nothing. It could easily be translated the have-nots. Let's have a quick look at 1 Corinthians 11. In the following instructions I do not commend you, because when you come together it's not for the better or to the worse. For to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and to some extent I believe it. Back to the divisions again. But verse 20, when you come together, it's not really to eat the Lord's Supper, because when the time comes to eat, each one of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. And there's been a fair amount of ink spilled on this phrase, those who have nothing. In summary, the key question is whether the expression "those who have nothing" implies something, a specific thing that they lack, which in this case would be, do you show contempt for the Church of God and humiliate those who have received nothing of the shared meal? That's one way of reading that, and it would be acceptable as an interpretation. But there's also plenty of evidence in antiquity of the expression "those who have nothing" referring to a kind of generalised lack, such as we might apply to the poor, rather than just those who missed out. And so how we translate the phrase "those who have nothing" is key for this passage. Is it referring to those who miss out on the elements of the meal, and it's the elements of the meal of which they have nothing? Or does it refer to those who have nothing, the poor, who are unable to bring something and have to make do with poorer fare than the others? I think it's probably the latter. which at some level shows that at least some of the divisions in the Corinthian church are divisions between those who are moderately wealthy versus those who are more poor. And it may very well be that some of the socio-economic divisions, the poverty and the wealth, the social status and the dishonourable status, these sorts of things, it may very well be that, that all of these things line up on opposite sides of the same divide, that actually it may very well be that those who think of themselves as wise are also those who think of themselves as strong, are also those who have access to a few bob, who are also those who are misbehaving at the Lord's Supper, who are also those who think that they're free to engage their sexual appetites with prostitutes, and so on and so on and so on. And it may very well be that what we've got is a really quite complicated and dense problem that's manifesting itself in multiple ways, but it's one problem, a problem of a relatively articulate, in their own eyes, elite, again, in their own eyes, who believe that they're free to live in a way that's in a way that has little regard for those with less status than they have. And it's worth thinking that through. And there's been lots of work written on that, but the key thinkers in this regard have been people like David Horrell, Gert Tyson, Wayne Meeks, John Barclay. I've assumed in some of my materials some of the ideas of these people, and there's certainly a strong case that there might be a kind of unity to all of these problems. Not all unity is good unity. Then let's have a quick look at worship, gender and early Christian meeting places. And I'm going to scoot through this because actually what we're going to do next time is address this in much more earnest. But it's just to say that some of the issues touched upon in regard to worship and speech, they also bear on the place of males and females in wider society and in the church. So what was at stake in those debates? It's worth remembering that honour and shame are used quite heavily in 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16. And so whatever might be going on theologically in that passage, it's also intersecting with broader cultural values as well. In summary, chapter 11, the Holy Spirit is able to speak through women, but they must dress like women, as that culture, as Paul understands it, when this occurs. Chapter 14, when not speaking spiritually, women ought to follow the customary Oriental practice of silence in public. And so you can see there that there's a really interesting set of theological questions. What is female speech when it's praying and prophesying? I suspect that in chapter 11, Paul thinks of the women praying and prophesying not so much as speaking on their own behalf, but as speaking spiritually. In other words, it's the Holy Spirit speaking through them. And so, of course, they must be allowed to speak under those circumstances, but in chapter 14, when they're not speaking spiritually, they ought to be quiet. That might be a massive oversimplification, and of course it will be a massive oversimplification. Of course, there are other ways of thinking this through. Lucy Pepiat, who's, and hopefully you'll enjoy the dialogue between myself and Lucy. I've got lots of links for you to Lucy's work. She's fabulous. Lucy Pepiat argues that at least some of the material attributed to Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 is actually Paul quoting the Corinthians in order to refute them. Now, I think that's an idea that's worth exploring. It isn't an idea I agree with, but it's an idea that's worth exploring, and it certainly solves a lot of theological problems. I'll let Lucy convince you of that. What I think is clearer is that Paul appears to be treating the church as a kind of public space, and this means that we need to ask something about how early Christians used space. It's also worth bearing in mind that house churches, well, you'd need to make at least two mental adjustments as you went from engaging with a space as a house to engaging with a space as a church. Firstly, you'd have to treat what was ordinarily private space as if it was public. That might be one of the reasons why Paul expects the women to veil and to be quiet. Second, you would have needed to rethink ordinary social relations attached to high and low status persons in such a space. Who is the leader of the congregation? Is it the person leading worship, or is it the person who owns the house? And are these the same individual? It must be really quite remarkable. Imagine that you were relatively low status out there in the world, but in the church you were the leader of the congregation. And then you had to preside at a dinner or officiate at the Lord's Supper alongside the master of the house. That would be really quite an interesting kind of social tension, I think. And of course this raises the question of social boundaries, because of course how we do things within an enclosed space of an association and how things are organised out there in the world, well, those are two separate things. And John Barclay has written a very good essay on that called Social Contrasts in Pauline Christianity, in which he contrasts Paul's attitude towards the Thessalonians to his attitude towards the Corinthians. And what characterises the difference in that attitude is the Thessalonians are having a hard time but are holding up and being faithful. The Corinthians are having an easy time, and maybe that's because they're not terribly distinctive. And of course there's a real question there, I think, about whether the unity of the church for Paul implies what sociologists would call a sectarian identity. In other words, what's the relationship between having a very well-defined boundary between yourself and the world? It could be a very permeable boundary, but you need to know where it is. And strong in-group bounds. Is there a relationship between Paul's attempt to differentiate the Corinthian church from its wider culture and the way in which he expects them to express a radical solidarity with one another? And the really demanding question here is, what might this say to a present-day established church which has declining numbers and a litany of internal theological disagreements in a mid-sized northern European country? I couldn't possibly guess where this church is or which church it is, and I know that that's a bit of a naughty question, but actually, you know, one of the things that we have to do when we're preaching these texts is make sense of what the text meant and also what it might mean for us. And actually, is there a message here for us that's attached to this question of sectarian identity and strong in-group bounds? Might it be that one of the reasons why Anglicans fight is that we are very well assimilated into the establishment of our culture? Even the ones that want to change everything. Just worth thinking about. What might Paul say to this? And the last theological topic I want to address is the resurrection. And so I'm just quickly going to take you to 1 Corinthians 15. Where are we? Here we are. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. First thing to note is Paul believes he's handing on traditions. I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and so on. But the problem begins with verse 12. If Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say there is no resurrection of the dead? We need to explore that. And what we need to explore is what the Corinthian beliefs might have been and what Paul's beliefs might be as they're indicated by his response. So let's begin with Paul's response. Paul says, if there is no resurrection, then Christ has not been raised. And so, if the Corinthians didn't believe in any resurrections, including Jesus' resurrection, then this wouldn't really be something that Paul would say. Paul's reply, if there is no resurrection, then Christ has not been raised, suggests at the very least that the Corinthians do believe that Jesus has been raised. And this means that the Corinthians who doubted the resurrection weren't doubting Jesus' resurrection, they were doubting their own. This doesn't mean that they didn't believe in an afterlife. It just means that they denied that their own bodies would be resurrected. Now, it's worth bearing that in mind. That might be a major problem in 1 Corinthians, because if we go and have a quick look at 1 Corinthians 6, let's see. 1 Corinthians 6, and then we go to the section about is it okay for Corinthian men to visit prostitutes? Food for the stomach for food, verse 13, and God will destroy both one and the other. I think the Corinthians are saying both of these things, and Paul responds to the first with, the body is not meant for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord the body. You see how similar that is to food for the stomach and the stomach for food? No, the body for the Lord and the Lord the body. And then in response to the Corinthians claiming God will destroy both one and the other, in other words, the body is transient, therefore it doesn't matter what we do with it, I think Paul says God raised the Lord and will also raise us by his power, verse 14. Can you see that? And God raised the Lord and will also raise us by his power. So in other words, Paul's response to the Corinthians claiming that they're visiting prostitutes, it's okay to visit prostitutes, because the body is transient, Paul's response is, the body will be raised. So let's go back to 1 Corinthians 15. So back to if there is no resurrection from the dead, then Christ has not been raised. So let's have a look. Well, the second thing to say about Paul's response is that if there is no resurrection, then Christ has not been raised. It seems to indicate that Paul regards Christ's resurrection and our own resurrection as a single event, as the same category of event. Hence, denying our own resurrection is to deny the resurrection. And, well, what do we say about the resurrection of Christ? It's not a question of denying whether it's possible to raise. It's more to point to the underlying belief in Jewish apocalyptic and prophetic literature that there is a single resurrection event at the end of the age. And the image here is that the resurrection has begun with the first fruits of the harvest in Jesus, and we will be the main harvest. the point there is that the first fruits aren't different, separate from the harvest. They're the first fruits of the harvest. In other words, there's one resurrection, the resurrection which has begun in Jesus Christ, but which concludes with our own resurrection. And this is standard Jewish theology, modified a bit because of Paul's Christological commitments. And the idea there is that the new age has begun with the resurrection of Jesus and the giving of the eschatological spirit to the church, and it will conclude when we ourselves are raised. And that's a single event. It might stretch, now speaking, 2,000 years and more, but for Paul it's a single event. Now the Corinthians seem to be differentiating the post-mortem destiny of believers from the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and there are lots of different reasons why they might have done this. Well, one thing that they might have done is they might have associated the idea of the resurrection exclusively with the resurrection of Jesus. And so, believing firmly in that, they now believe that the resurrection is over. And that the new age is totally realised, and that the gifts of the Spirit are, full manifestations of the kingdom. And there's some evidence for this belief in the way that the Corinthians regard these gifts, and certainly how they regard the status of wisdom and what it does to their freedom to live as they choose. And Anthony Thistleton, who is an absolutely superb scholar, wrote an essay on over-realised eschatology in Corinth. If you can find it, look it up. It's on the online journals. Second, it may be that the Corinthian fascination with popular philosophy, those slogans like everything is yours, everything is free to do anything, it may very well be that this fascination with popular philosophy leads them to regard mundane embodiment as improper for post-mortem or celestial existence. It may be that Paul's interacting with that view in 1 Corinthians 15, 35-41, where he compares earthly bodies with heavenly bodies. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one thing and that of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, another of the moon, and another of the stars. So it is with the resurrection of the dead. And it may very well be that the Corinthians simply thought that the idea of physical embodiment in a mundane sense is improper for celestial experience, and that actually when that they might be embodied celestially, like stars or like fire, or in a material called pneuma, spirit. And Paul might be interacting with that view, and certainly Dale Martin, in his wonderful commentary, The Corinthian Body, interacts with that view as well. Or maybe, number 3, the Corinthians' prior experience of Greco-Roman religions has caused them to think that only heroic figures are raised to immortal physicality. And there's a chap called Paul Brown who wrote a good but very expensive book on this, entitled Bodily Resurrection and Ethics, in 1 Corinthians 15. Or it may be that the Corinthian belief is an amalgam of all of these and something else. But it's clear there that Paul's response in chapter 15 is a way of trying to get the Corinthians to see that believing the resurrection of Jesus but not believing in their own isn't consistent with the gospel as he understands it. And then the last issue is this a single argument? I think you can probably guess from some of my comments that I think there are common ideas and themes. There may be a commonality to the problem. It may be that the battle lines of each of the individual arguments fall down with the same groups of people on each side, on opposite sides each time. But it's very difficult to know what the overarching theme is. It may be, as Dale Martin says, body. You know, he thinks that the body is the basic theme in 1 Corinthians. It may be wisdom. It may be resurrection. It may be freedom. It may be popular philosophy. What is clear, though, is that we're not going to find that out in the next minute, because I need to break now and finish this video, because I think I've given you enough to be going on with. So thank you so much for listening to this video. I hope I've not given you too much of a kind of brain dump. Do write to me by email if you need clarification on any points. I'll do my very best. If a few of you write and it hasn't quite hit where it needed to hit, then we can address this in the seminars on Wednesday. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your weekend. God bless. Take care.